Hi there! In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how I process a Milky Way photograph using Lightroom, Photoshop and Luminosity Masks. 2022 was a great year for me as I got to visit two really dark locations here in India. I was in Andaman in March and Singalila National Park in October. I have practiced and fine-tuned the technique that I'm about to show you on my Milky Way photos from these places. You'll need to know the basics of Photoshop to follow along. I'll be using adjustment layers and masks in Photoshop extensively. But once you get a hang of this technique, it is easy to learn and is repeatable. I used the TK8 panel by Tony Kuiper to generate luminosity masks. To know more about this panel and luminosity masks, visit his website goodlight.us. Let's head over to the darkroom now to see how we can maximize the dynamic range of the Milky Way and bring out the detail and color in the core. The image on the left is the one which I'll be editing in this video. You can see the result from a previous edit on the right. The image on the right has more detail and dynamic range. This image was captured using a Sony a7C full frame camera and a 20mm f1.8G lens. It was captured at 15 seconds, f1.8 and ISO 1600. Let's head over to the develop module of Lightroom and then into Photoshop to edit this file. I'm now in the develop module of Lightroom Classic and I'm going to make a few basic edits here before taking this image to Photoshop for further edits. Then I'll save the PST file from Photoshop and bring it back to Lightroom for some final tweaks. Let's get started. I'll first go into the detail panel and reduce the sharpening from a value of 40, which is the default value, to 0. This is because the default amount of sharpening ends up sharpening the noise in the image as well. We'll apply sharpening later in the workflow. Next, I'll go into the lens corrections panel and select the two checkboxes, remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Lightroom picks up the profile automatically from the EXIF information. If not, you can make a selection from the drop-down list. I'm going to deselect this checkbox and select it again so you can see the difference. This is without profile corrections and this is with profile corrections. Great. Next, I'll go into the basic panel and I'll change my profile, which is currently set to Adobe Color. For that, I'll click Browse to open the profile browser and select Neutral. I find this to be a good profile to make color corrections. I'm going to close the profile browser and next I'm going to correct the white balance. This image has a strong reddish color cast. The usual method is to select a preset from the drop down or use the white balance selector tool and take it to an area of the image that has the color cast and let Lightroom automatically correct the white balance. I'm going to undo this and show a manual method. I'm first going to increase the vibrance and saturation sliders all the way to 100. This amplifies all the colors in the image and I can see that there is a strong yellow cast. Next, I'm going to play with the temp and tint sliders till there's an equal balance of blues, yellows, greens and magenta in the sky portion of the image. So I'm going to push the temp slider towards the blue to reduce the yellow color cast. And then I'm going to push the tint slider to the left to reduce the magenta color cast. And I think now there is a good balance of these colors. So I'm going to bring the vibrance and saturation sliders back to 0. Next, I'm going to make some tonal corrections. I'm going to increase the exposure by a value of about 1. This makes the image bright. Next, I'll push the black slider So the histogram is more towards the center. I'm going to check for shadow and highlight clipping by selecting these indicators. So this is the shadow clipping indicator. When I zoom in, I see blue patches which indicates the areas that have shadow clipping. But I'm going to ignore this because the mountain is dark anyways. Next, I'm going to check for highlight clipping. When I zoom in, I see red patches around the lights in this town. But those are what we call as specular highlights. So I'm going to ignore that as well. Right now, the image is ready to be exported to Photoshop for further edits. I'm going to right click the image in the film strip, go to Edit In and select Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. The image is now available in Photoshop and it is available as a smart object as indicated by this icon in the thumbnail. Now what is a smart object? When I double click this thumbnail, I get the Camera Raw dialog box and all my edits from Lightroom are available here. So a smart object carries forward all the edits from Lightroom into Photoshop. I'm going to cancel this and make use of the smart object later in the workflow. First, I'm going to show you what adjustment layers are and then talk about the TK8 Multi-Mask panel. I'll go to the Adjustments panel. If you don't see this panel, go to Window, Workspace and select Photography. From this panel, I can generate different types of adjustment layers. For example, a brightness contrast adjustment layer, a levels adjustment layer, a curves adjustment layer, so on and so forth. I'm going to be predominantly using curves adjustment layer in this tutorial. When I click this button, I get a new layer and it has two components. It has a curves component and it has a mask component. Right now the curves component is selected and I can adjust the curve using this dialog box. When I select the mask component, I get a different dialog box. The mask is currently set to white. White reveals and black hides. What that means is when I make an adjustment using this curve, the adjustment is visible throughout the image because of the white mask. White reveals. If I want to take away the effect of the curve from parts of the image, then I can paint black on the mask. So let me do that. I'll take the paint brush, ensure that my foreground is set to black. The hardness is set to a very low value. The opacity is set to 100 and I'll select the mask component and paint on the image. I'm not painting black on the image, but I'm painting black on the mask. Areas where I'm painting black don't receive the effect of the curve. So now when I turn this layer off and on, you can see that the effect of the curve is visible only in the core of the Milky Way. And that's indicated by the white in the mask as well. The problem of using a paintbrush to take away the effect of the adjustment layer is that it is only as accurate as your brush strokes. So we'll use a different method to generate these masks. And that's where the TK8 Multi-Mask panel comes in. I can generate masks from various sources. For example, luminosity masks, range masks, color masks, vibrance and saturation masks. I'm going to delete this adjustment layer and I'm going to click the luminosity mask generation button. This opens up a new dialog box, and from this dialog box I can generate darks masks, lights masks, midtone masks, and I can output the masks as a curves adjustment layer, a levels adjustment layer, so on and so forth. Or I can output it as a selection or directly onto the layer. Right now you're looking at a preview of a lights 1 mask. When I click the 2 button, this is a preview of a lights 2 mask. What that means is the selection of the bright portion to the dark portion of the image is based on the luminosity information available in the pixels. Since it's based on the luminosity information available in the pixels, the gradation of the selection is natural and self-feathering. So in a lights 2 mask, more of the bright areas of the image are selected and less of the dark areas of the image are selected. And that's why you have both black and white and varying shades of gray in this preview. Similarly, if I select a darks 1 mask, more of the mountain is selected, and that's indicated by this white color around the mountain. Similarly, more of the sky is selected, indicated by the gray color in the sky. And none of the stars are selected, as indicated by these black spots. And that's how you use the luminosity mask generation panel. Now I'm going to select the lights 1 mask and output it as a curves adjustment layer. I get the curves adjustment layer with the mask already applied to it. Earlier we had a white mask and we used the paint brush to paint away the effect using the black foreground. But now we have the adjustment layer with the mask already applied to it. And the mask is based on the luminosity information in the pixels of the image. And I generated the mask using this panel here. Now when I make an adjustment using the S curve, it is constrained by this mask. And since the luminosity mask is self-feathering, the effect of the curve is natural. I'm going to turn this layer off and on so you can see the difference. I can still go ahead and paint on the mask using the brush. So if I don't want the effect of the curve from the foreground at all, I can paint away the effect completely. I'm going to delete this and I'm going to start making my edits on the Milky Way image using these luminosity masks. Let's get started. First, I'm going to apply noise reduction. For that, I'm going to right-click the Smart Object layer and select New Smart Object via Copy. Now I have two smart objects and they're not linked to each other because I duplicated them by clicking New Smart Object via Copy. When I double-click the topmost smart object, I can go into the Detail tab and increase the noise reduction. I can apply a noise reduction of say 60. Now when I click OK, the top layer has noise reduction. Applying noise reduction always ends up making the image look soft. So to bring back the sharpness in the image, I can apply a darks 1 mask to this layer. What that does is it applies the noise reduction only to the dark areas of the image. Let me go to the luminosity mask generation panel and select darks 1. Now this is a preview of the darks 1 mask. I can output it directly to this layer and I get the layer mask here. Now this layer mask is constraining the effect of the noise reduction and applying it only to the dark areas of the image, and hence the image regains its sharpness. The stars, the core of the Milky Way, the edges of the mountain, etc. are sharp again. I'm going to uncheck this layer and check it back again. You may not see a lot of difference because of the YouTube video compression, but I can see the difference here. I'm going to merge these two layers because I don't need them anymore. Next, I'm going to introduce a new layer known as the star reduction layer. The sky has a lot of stars here, but I'm going to reduce the density of the stars so I can bring out the detail in the core of the Milky Way. I have a Photoshop action ready to reduce stars. So I'm going to go into the Actions panel and I'm going to run the Photoshop action. If you want a copy of this Photoshop action, leave a comment in the video below. When I run the Photoshop action, I get two interactive dialog boxes. In the first interactive dialog box, I have to make a selection of the stars by moving the fuzziness and range sliders. So right now, this is a preview of the areas of the image that are going to be selected. By default, I think a good number of stars are selected. So I'm just going to hit OK. Otherwise, I can move the fuzziness and range sliders till I have a good selection of the stars. When I hit OK, I get the next interactive dialog box. In this dialog box, I can remove the effect of the selection from parts of the image. For example, I don't want any selection in the horizon. So with the brush selected and with the brush changed to subtract from selection, I'm going to paint away the selection from the horizon and the mountains. Now when I click OK, the Photoshop action runs and generates a new layer known as the star reduction layer. And this layer has fewer stars. I'm going to hide the layer and show it again so you can see the difference. Next, I'm going to use Luminosity Masks to bring out the contrast and detail in the Milky Way core. I'm going to go into the Luminosity Generation panel and I'm going to select a Lights to Mask. Now this preview tells me that the Lights to Mask makes a good selection of the core of the Milky Way. But I can edit the preview itself. So I can use a curves adjustment layer and edit the preview to enhance my selection. When I make the curve more contrasty, more of the core of the Milky Way is going to be selected. So now I'm going to output this as a curves adjustment layer. And like earlier, we have a curves adjustment layer with the curves component and the mask component. Now I'm going to use the curves dialog box to add contrast. And remember, since the mask is already applied, the effect of the curve is going to be constrained. I'm going to use the hand tool in the curves dialog box, take it to a bright portion of the Milky Way and push it up. When I do this, Photoshop samples the luminosity information in that area and increases it in brightness because I push the cursor up. If I take the cursor to a dark area of the Milky Way and push my cursor down, Photoshop samples the pixels in that area and makes them darker. So now I have an S curve and that has introduced contrast. When I turn this layer off and on, you can see the difference. The core of the Milky Way is now standing out. I'm going to repeat these steps, but this time I'm going to use a Lights 1 mask. So first I'm going to enhance the preview. So the selection of the Milky Way core is more contrasty. And then I'm going to output it to a adjustment layer. And then I'm going to use the hand tool, take it to a bright portion of the Milky Way and push my cursor up. Next, I'll take it to a dark portion of the Milky Way and push my cursor down. And I've introduced an S curve. When I turn this layer off and on, you can see the difference. Now, the next step that I'm going to do is specific to this image. You don't have to do it for all images. I'm going to select the mask component and I'm going to add a slight feather of say a value of 10. And that's because I want my curve to be feathered. Similarly, I'll go here and add a feather of 10. When I add a feather, the effect of the curve becomes softer. I'm going to group these two layers and call the group Milky Way Enhancement. When I turn this layer group off and on, you can see the difference. Now the adjustments that we made using these curves have affected the horizon and this region of the image as well. I can paint away the effect by adding a mask by clicking this icon here, using a brush with a black foreground and opacity set to 100 and painting away the effect from the foreground and the mountains. So now the effect of the curve is limited to the sky. I'm going to turn the layer off and on so you can see the difference. Next, I'm going to darken the sky and reduce the reddishness in the sky. For that, I'm going to generate a darks 1 mask, because a darks 1 mask selects most of the sky. Of course, it makes a selection of the mountain as well, but we can paint out the effect later. I'm going to output this as a curves adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to change the blend mode from normal to multiply. When I do that, Photoshop darkens the area of the sky which is selected by this curve and which is held back by this mask. I'm going to generate another luminosity mask, a darks 2 mask this time, and I'm going to output it to a curves adjustment layer. And now I'm going to go into the red channel. By default, we always work in the RGB channel, but now I'm going to go into the red channel. I'm going to select the hand tool, take it to an area of the image that has the reddish color cast, and gently push my cursor down. Photoshop starts taking away the reddishness of the image from those areas. I have to be careful and not push my cursor down too much, because then the image turns green. Let me undo this and push my cursor down gently. I'll also go into the blue channel and increase the blues ever so slightly. Now I think the sky has a neutral color cast. I'm going to merge these two layers and call it Sky Enhancement. Like earlier, I'm going to add a mask to this group. Use a brush, but this time I'm going to reduce the opacity to a value of 20 and paint away the effect from the foreground. Now when I turn the layer off and on, you can see the kind of difference it has introduced to the image. Next, I'm going to try and reduce the blues in this area of the sky. I find this to be slightly distracting. For that, I'm going to go back to the luminosity generation panel, and I'm going to use a lights mask which targets more of this area of the image. So let me cycle through the lights 1, lights 2, lights 3 masks. I think a lights 2 mask makes a good selection, but I will modify the mask, brighten the preview slightly, and then I will output it to an adjustment layer. Now I will go into the blue channel, use the hand tool, take it to this area of the image and gently push my cursor down. When I do that, the blues in the image reduces. I'm going to turn this layer off and on so you can see the difference. If I feel that this has affected the rest of the sky adversely, I can paint black on this mask to take away the effect. First, I'll change the opacity to about 60 and then paint away the effect from the rest of the sky. I'm not going to touch this portion of the sky. Now I'm going to go back to this curve and making sure that I'm in the RGB channel, I'm going to use the hand tool and gently bring down the luminosity of this portion of the sky. So now when I turn this layer off and on, you can see that we have not only reduced the blues in this part of the sky, we've also reduced the luminosity. Next, I'm going to do some freehand dodging and burning. There are different ways of dodging and burning an image in Photoshop. I'm going to be using the dodge and burn tools available within Photoshop. To do that, I have to first generate what is known as a stamped visible layer. To generate the stamped visible layer, the Photoshop shortcut will flash on your screen now. I'm just going to use the TK8 combo panel where there is a dedicated button to generate a stamped visible layer. Now when I click this button, I get a new pixel layer, and this pixel layer has the effects of all the layers below it stamped onto it. And this is the stamp visible layer. When I turn this layer off, you don't see any difference because we have not worked on this layer yet. I'm going to turn it back on. But when I turn the layers below it off, you still don't see any difference. And that's because a pixel layer blocks the effect of all the layers below it. And that is why it's important to work using adjustment layers. Any effect that you apply to a pixel layer is permanent, and a pixel layer blocks the layers below it. I'm going to turn these layers back on. And now I'm going to work on this stamp visible layer. I'm going to use the burn tool first. I'm going to change the range to mid-tones, keep a low exposure of 10%, increase the size of the brush, and click the Milky Way core once. What that does is it darkens the dark areas of the Milky Way core. Next, I'm going to switch to the dodge tool. Ensure that my range is set to mid-tones. Reduce my exposure to 10%. Increase the size of the brush slightly and paint on these areas of the Milky Way. I'm going to avoid this area of the Milky Way because it is already bright. When I turn this layer off and on, you can see the difference. I'm going to call this the dodge and burn layer. I think the image is now ready to be taken into Lightroom for some final tweaks. Before we do that, I'm going to hide all the layers except the base layer to show you where we started off from. This is how the image looked when we exported it from Lightroom. After applying noise reduction, we introduced a star reduction layer. Then we made Milky Way enhancements. And then we enhanced the sky. And then I introduced a curves layer to reduce the blue in the horizon. And finally, I did some dodging and burning around the core of the Milky Way. I'm going to save this image and we'll head over to Lightroom for some final tweaks. I'm now in the develop module of Lightroom and the image that we just edited in Photoshop is available here. I'll go into the detail panel and apply some sharpening. Remember, we brought the sharpening down to 0 before starting the editing process. I'm going to apply a sharpening of 60. Now this number is not important because it depends on your lens and camera combination. But what is important is that after you apply sharpening, you mask away the areas that don't need to receive sharpening. And to do that, I'm going to hold the Alt key on a Windows machine or the Option key on a Mac and push the masking slider to the right. Right now, the image is white, which means that the entire image receives the sharpening. When I push the masking slider to the right, I can see a preview of the areas of the image that are going to receive sharpening. Areas which are white will receive the sharpening and areas which are dark don't receive the sharpening. So I'm going to push the masking slider till only the stars and the edges of the mountain receive sharpening. A value of about 80 looks just about right. I'm going to leave the masking slider and I can see that the image is nicely sharpened. Next, I'm going to address this gap in the histogram. And to do that, I'm going to push the whites slider to the right till the gap goes away. And finally, I'm going to try and reduce the luminosity just above the horizon a little bit. Now this is purely optional. Some people may not want to do this, but I want to show you some of the advanced tools available in Lightroom. So let me go into the masking panel. Let me go into the range mask and select the luminance range mask. Now I get an eyedropper tool and I can click the area of the image whose luminance values I want to edit. I'm going to take it to this part of the image and click. Lightroom makes a selection based on the luminance values in this part of the image. I can modify the selection by pushing this slider left or right. And I'm going to go into the highlights and reduce the highlights to make the luminance value of this area dark. Now that has also affected the core of the Milky Way. To take away the edit that we just made from the core of the Milky Way, I'm going to use the subtract option. And I can subtract using these different tools. I'm going to use the brush tool. I'm going to ensure that the flow is not set to 100 and the feather is a high value and the density is also a high value, and I'm going to paint away the effect from the core of the Milky Way. Now when I do a before and after, you can see that the area near the horizon has become dark. If I find that this area is too green in color, I can go back to my create mask option, and this time I can create a color range mask. I want to reiterate that these are some advanced tools that I'm showing you. It's not necessary that you have to apply these tools to every image. When I click the color range mask, I can take it to an area of the image whose colors I want to sample. For example, this area. And I can refine the edge of the mask using this slider. Now I can bring the saturation down so the image is not that green near the horizon. I can also push the color slider slightly to the left to make it blue, and push the tint slider slightly to the right to make it less green. And now when I do a before and after, you can see the difference. I'm going to introduce a radial gradient. I'm going to draw the radial gradient around the core of the Milky Way. And now I'm going to increase the dehaze. I'm going to push the dehaze slider slightly to the right. I'm also going to introduce more saturation by pushing the saturation slider to the right. And when I close this mask dialog box and go back to the before and after, you can see that we have brought out more color and detail in the Milky Way core. I'm going to go to the before and after so you can see the difference again. As a final step, I'm going to go back to the white balance section and I'm going to reduce the tint slightly. I'm going to push the tint slider to the right because I think the image has a greenish tint right now. So I'm going to push it by a value of say 3. And with this, the image is ready for export. The image on the left is the raw file that we started editing, and we've come a long way after the edits in Photoshop and Lightroom. The image on the right has so much more detail and dynamic range. When people ask me if a Milky Way image is real or not, I tell them yes. All the detail in the Milky Way is available in the raw file. It's left to us how much of it we can bring out in post-processing. I hope this video tutorial was useful and you picked up some tips and tricks. See you in the next one.